So on the first night of Lent, before heading to sleep, I started meditating, which I'm trying to make a personal routine. Whenever I meditate, I tend to just try and work on emotional management and my relationship with Christ, and basically trying to sort out my reservations with the Bible, essentially. And a big one is that deep down, I feel like the whole system for being admitted into the Promised Land is kind of unfair, as those who submit to Jesus are rewarded, and those who deny him are, sent to hell. Obviously, as a person who loves Jesus and believes him as the embodiment of love and who sacrificed his life for me, I'm more than happy to submit to him. But there are people out there who have not heard his story. There are people out there who were raised in an anti-Christian environment, and there are people out there that simply don't even like the idea of submitting to a higher power regardless. And some of these atheists, some of these non-believers, they could be, wonderful people. And Christian theology teaches us that God is all just. So obviously, I don't think my morality has more grounding than, the man upstairs. But to me, my personal beliefs, it doesn't seem very fair, especially for like eternal punishment in hell, if you get what I mean. I was meditating about this when I realized that a lot of the Bible actually does kind of contradict this idea. For example, Yeshua's Beatitudes, which bless the righteous, the meek, those who fight for justice and stuff. That's not like, mutually exclusive to believers. That, as I said before, many atheists are some of the kindest people I know, and many Christians today are like genuine scumbags. But then I had an idea, basically. What if by embodying Yeshua's message and following the commandments, despite an earthly official submission to God via religious alignment, you are still embodying his principles and you are still fundamentally submitting to him and his love by obeying his laws? Obviously, most atheists will base their morals off their, environment and their parents and the messages that society pushes. But once you realize that most of our, morality is derived from mythology and religion, you could make an argument that they are inadvertently, obeying God's commandments. Even if we created all the laws ourselves, secular laws and religious laws, they do, coincide. Atheists are still like obeying God. Plus, like, when an atheist like loves someone, okay, or like does something kind for someone, there's multiple very interesting ways that people do good things for people. Some people do good things because, again, society has taught them that's the way it is, and they've been intrinsically raised to believe that there is a reward for doing goodness, which again stems from mythology and religion. There are some people that they are selfless to others and they are kind to others because, they want to make other people feel happier. But that's an interesting point, because if there is no God, there is no metaphysical anything, and we are just, meatbags with a brain like operating us, then there is no intrinsic happiness per se by the traditional definition of the word. It is just brain chemicals stimulating positive emotions for our benefit as we enjoy human flourishing and we enjoy being able to thrive. So people doing something for us, our brain will reward it. If true happiness and true gratitude isn't a thing, then I mean, is there much reason to be kind to others? So there's an argument that I researched that basically being selfless to others is a subconscious acknowledgement that there is a metaphysical, spiritual factor that deeply values happiness, can be truly touched by selflessness. And if there is a metaphysical value to us, apart from our brains, something that just gives us like that kind of need and ought to be kind to others, then that is the admission that the soul exists. And when you go further down that road, the admission that the soul exists is an admission that spirituality exists. And then when we go down the monotheistic route, then that leads to God. So in other words, being selfless leads to God. If I were to simplify this, righteousness and being kind to others is the acknowledgement that there is something deeper within us, even if you don't acknowledge it like consciously with your religious alignment. So you do believe in God by doing this. Plus, obviously Christians believe that, we are God's children, and so being kind to others and celebrating others is being obedient to God's message and valuing God's creations. Another thing that supports this theory is many of Yeshua's arguments against the Pharisees, where he spoke of the unimportance of tradition and racial, lines, more focused on a universal message of love. He told them, you follow the commandments of man rather than the commandments of God, implying that, you know, racial, religious barriers, they aren't super relevant, and that what truly matters are the fundamental truths of the universe, which is, love and justice. And that's what Yeshua is. So no matter how much Torah you can memorize and, how many Sanhedrin members you suck off behind the synagogue, if you're an asshole, then it doesn't really matter. 1 John chapter 4 verses 7 says, everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God, which supports this idea even further. So when we get to this point, the theory isn't about denouncing the idea that believers go to heaven and unbelievers go to hell. I still 100% believe in that. Everyone who doesn't believe in God will go to hell. But the question now becomes, what do we define as a believer and a non-believer? Is it a physical document about your church attendance, or is it your fundamental submission to God's message? If you embody God's principles and follow his laws, then do you not believe, subconsciously, do you not believe in goodness, that the universal truth of the universe is goodness, and you believe that these are good values worthy to be followed, and that these are good rules worthy to be obeyed? If an atheist is kind to others, do they believe that that person is special enough to deserve that kindness? Do they believe that a person has something other than a brain that can reciprocate that kindness truly? And if they do, then there is an argument that that can lead to God, regardless of your physical religious alignment, or whatever religion your family is, or just your life circumstances, whether you go to a church or not, whether you've even heard of the gospel, because there are still billions of people throughout history who have never heard the story of Jesus Christ. And so are the unbelievers the people who reject God's message, the people who value hatred and violence and, gluttony and lust? The atheists, the ones who don't believe in higher love and higher purpose and stuff, the ones who choose to destroy. And so are they the ones that deserve to go to hell? And the believers, the righteous and the loving and the meek and the selfless, are they the ones that deserve to go to heaven? So this is the framework of the inclusive salvation theory. Now, obviously, ideological extremism is wrong. I do not believe with one of those extremist left-wing churches that doesn't even believe in God, and that he's just kind of an idea to pursue for, social issues and stuff. But God is real, and I do think that studying scripture, following the rules if you can, studying gospels, getting to know the story of Yeshua, studying Israeli history, that is all important. The church is a good thing, but there's a balance. And the thing is, I think that was one of Yeshua's, prime messages of the gospels, because he didn't fully obey the Torah. He disobeyed a lot of the rules, but he still didn't destroy it entirely. He quoted Torah frequently in his speeches and stuff. So it's a balance between maintaining tradition and history, but also the personal spiritual journey and the universalist fundamental truths that can appeal to everybody. For Jesus did say the gospel will be known to the whole world. And even though, Christianity has made a really good attempt, with the number one religion at the minute, not everyone knows the gospel, and there are billions who have died without hearing it. Not to mention, most people's religion are determined by their, parents and where they're born. So inclusive salvation, the idea kind of solves that issue as well. However, there are a number of very strong counter-arguments to this point. A big one is the atheist objective morals idea. The idea that objective morality can exist without a God. Because, for example, we can create rules based on, human flourishing, like how society progresses. So don't kill people because we need them, and we need each other. We are a codependent species. We need each other to survive. And so we create moral foundations based on our survival and us flourishing. And we follow those rules because they are what is objectively good for all of us, no God required. Plus, as we know that human suffering is objectively bad, then you can just create rules against killing and against, hurting people because we want to escape suffering. So, like, objectively, morally, we want to avoid those things. So those are the main arguments for the reasons why we can have objective morals without God. However, I disagree. Rules may be good for human flourishing, but who said that human flourishing is good for everybody else? Because humans are destroying, everything. We're destroying all the animals, the planet. So even if we create morals that are good for us, then are those truly universal moral laws if they are the best for only us, like a tiny speck, and not good for everybody? Plus, not even all humans can agree on these rules because there's always going to be people that disagree with the moral foundations of society, and who's saying they're wrong? Just because they're in the minority, does the majority determine the rules? And plus, if humans are flawed and no one's perfect, then why do we have the authority to create these rules? If objective morality can still exist, if we isolate it just to, us as a human race, why can't I isolate objective morality to myself? Because I know what's best for everybody, And there are just no definitive answers to these questions without a supreme being that gave us laws to follow. A supreme being that is the embodiment of all pure good values. And he is the perfect example, so much that he came down and lived among us and gave us the gospel so that we can live our lives pure to his message. Also, how do we know that suffering is bad? Like, what if it's just, brain chemicals? How do we know that suffering and pain is inherently bad? Because there are people that enjoy pain. Is their opinion, less important just because they're in the minority? And so for those reasons, I believe objective morality exists with God. And so you could argue that following moral rules, even those of society, is a subconscious subordination towards God. And thus you are following Yahweh's commandments. A huge, big argument against the inclusive salvation idea, though, is the famous John chapter 14, verse 6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father without me. Jesus' very famous proclamation and a central part of Christian theology. And that kind of seems to debunk the inclusive salvation idea altogether, because it implies a direct conscious submission to Christ specifically. That Jewish preacher who roamed Israel, 2,000 years ago, that guy, you have to submit specifically to him. It is not universal. We are Christians. We are a religion. However, that same book, John chapter 12, verse 32 Jesus says, when I am lifted up, I will draw all people to me, which implies a undeniable, definitive revelation of Jesus towards all people, like what we call the rapture, I think. Basically, we can argue for the inclusive salvation in spite of this, because of the idea that if an atheist has true moral foundations in their heart, but their earthly upbringing has, turned them away from Christ because of, physical rules around religion or whatever, what the parents, etc. If they live a life of righteousness and, selflessness, embodying Yeshua's principles, then coming face to face with the embodiment of goodness, they will automatically submit to him. They won't have a choice. So that is why they are called the believers, and the believers go to the promised land, because they will be able to recognize that spirit in their heart regardless of their knowledge of the random Palestinian Jewish teacher from ages ago. Another very strong argument against this whole theory is Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and it is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. And that again seems to completely destroy this entire video, because it claims that our works, aka our good deeds, being righteous, they do not matter, and that only true faith and subordinate to God is important. That is the deciding factor. However, how do we know of our faith? The Bible has an answer, and I would like to introduce you to it. James chapter 2, verse 26. For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, and so faith apart from works is dead. So the only way we know that we have faith is by embodying works, by doing good deeds. So we are saved through faith, but you don't have faith without doing good deeds. And you can't do good deeds while contradicting God's values. So if an atheist does God's values, they have intrinsic fundamental faith in God, and so they are saved through their faith. That is the inclusive salvation, argument. I think this theory is interesting for discussions on, hell and stuff and the abyss, or whichever one it is. I need to work on my Christian cosmology. Because there's an idea that hell is simply a space without God's love and presence, where basically those who reject him are just free to chill there. But obviously, there's some Christians that have a more harsh view, whereas, God punishing them, burning them in fire. But there's the idea that, like, just a place without God's love is eternal punishment within itself, and it's just such a horrible space simply because God is not there. Because he loves people so much, he wouldn't force them to stay with him if they hated him. And with the inclusive salvation idea, when all people are revealed to, Christ, and they are being judged, if they reject his message, then they're free to go, because if they despise just the selflessness, they can just go to hell. And obviously, I think I mentioned earlier, but the inclusive salvation theory does it does kind of solve the unfairness of, for example, people who aren't raised Christians suffering for an eternity and stuff, because with this one it actually is a punishment of the wicked, thingy. That one verse goes hard. God laughs at the wicked, for he knows his time has come, which is another, verse that supports the inclusive salvation, because that is a direct reference to someone's deeds and actions rather than their faith. Matthew chapter 7, verse 16. By their fruits you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father. This is another quote from Yeshua that really embodies these principles. And in general, the Gospels just really change, the direction of the Bible, not direct contradiction of everything. They start worshipping idols, but just it really steers it in a new fundamental direction, for me at least. And yet Yeshua's message is truly universal in my opinion, because he said, for example, I said earlier, the Gospels, they didn't reach everybody, but the fundamental message of love and kindness that does reach everybody, that is universal. And so it does fulfill the promise that Yeshua said, because now everybody knows Christ through love, through those ideas, despite the whether they understand the physical Palestinian teacher man. He said, there is no Jew nor Gentile, there is no man nor woman, because you are all one in Christ. And so what we can take from this is that, religious alignment may not be as important as we, once thought. And obviously, I still agree that studying the Bible, going to church, and learning the story of Yeshua is important, and it is something every Christian should do and stuff. But there are people that don't have those luxuries, and then in that case, God's justice becomes something more. Instead of how many Bible verses you can memorize, it's how many Bible verses you embody. Because God is love, God is goodness, He is everything positive and beautiful and bright in the world. And so if I see a person who does not have a cross necklace, but they still, they feed the poor and they look after their brothers, they let people go in front of them, they, serve their community, how can I not say that they are from Jesus? I would like to end this video with my favorite gospel verses that I think really solidify this idea. Delivered by the Christ on the Sermon of the Mount, and these words have been immortalized throughout Christian theology. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Blessed are those impure of heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are those who live, for they shall surely learn. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.